Alyssa Grant, a black woman in handcuffs, sits silently in court falsely accused of assaulting a white cop. But what no one in that courtroom knows is that she's a covert CIA agent on a classified mission. Officer Brent Kessler, blinded by prejudice, doesn't just lie, he throws a punch that could unravel everything. What happens when a federal secret meets a racist fist in the very place meant for justice? Have you ever seen truth weaponized in silence? Tap the like button if you're ready. Let's step inside the courtroom. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Not because it was empty, it wasn't. There were enough eyes watching, enough murmurs behind cupped hands, enough curiosity clinging to the air like dust in sunlight. But the hush came from something else, something deeper. It was the kind of silence that follows a headline that never made it to print. And at the center of it all sat a woman in chains, Alyssa Grant. Mid-30s, tall, composed, unmistakably black. Her hands, though cuffed, rested gently on her lap as if she were waiting for a train, not a sentence. The tracking bracelet around her ankle peeked from beneath her slacks every time she shifted slightly in the defendant's chair. She wore no expression, no fear, no anger, not even fatigue. Just that same calm stare aimed somewhere far past the judge's bench, like her mind was moving through another timeline altogether. To the public record, she was the defendant in case number 04831, B assault and battery, against a law enforcement officer. That's what the docket said. That's what the newspapers would have said too if anyone had bothered to report it. But no one really knew who she was. Not the overworked public defender who sat beside her rifling through notes he barely understood. Not the smug district attorney who seemed more interested in the presence of local media than in the weight of justice. And certainly not the officer who had brought this case to life, Brent Kessler. Kessler stood tall, dressed in uniform, his posture rigid and rehearsed. He was a white man with a long jawline, clean-cut hair, and the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. His badge gleamed under the courtroom lights, but it was the glint of superiority in his eyes that stood out more. He had told his version of events before, that this woman had attacked him during a routine interaction, unprovoked, aggressive, dangerous. He recited it now with the same cadence, the same dramatic pauses. The judge, a man of few expressions and fewer words, barely looked at Alyssa as he reviewed the opening statements. To him, it seemed she was already on her way to a guilty verdict. But there was something strange about how Alyssa carried herself, something that didn't quite match the story being told about her. The woman sitting there didn't look like someone who had lost control. She looked like someone who had trained to keep it. The prosecutor made his case in polished terms, twisting the narrative around Alyssa's silence. He called it defiant, suggested it was proof of guilt. He emphasized the danger of a woman who would attack a uniformed officer in broad daylight, even without a weapon. It's not about what she said, he told the jury. It's about what she did, and her silence. That's the loudest evidence we have. The public defender, meanwhile, stumbled through a weak rebuttal. He mentioned trauma, vaguely insinuated mental stress without offering context, and ultimately leaned on the idea that maybe Alyssa had simply made a mistake. He didn't ask for justice, he asked for leniency. He didn't speak like someone who believed his client had a reason, and Alyssa, through all of it, didn't flinch. What no one in that courtroom knew, what no one was allowed to know, was that Alyssa wasn't just a defendant. She wasn't just a woman caught in a system that too often devoured women like her. She was a covert field officer for the CIA, embedded, under assignment, under orders. The moment her cover was blown, years of intelligence, dozens of lives, and the delicate balance of a classified operation would collapse. So she sat, and she took it. Not because she was powerless, but because power in its truest form is knowing when to strike and when to stay still. There was a kind of storm in the making that morning. You could feel it even if you didn't know what to call it yet. It clung to Alyssa's silence. It pulsed beneath every word Brent Kessler said, and it hung in the tension between truth and theater that this courtroom had become. A woman in chains was about to show everyone just how easily walls can break without ever raising her voice. Long before Alyssa found herself in that courtroom, shackled and silent, She had been chasing something far more dangerous than a courtroom verdict. Beneath the surface of routine patrols and standard reports, something darker had begun to stir, something that wore a badge but operated like a shadow. The call came just after 3 in the morning. No pleasantries, no names, just a directive. A folder had already been left for her, its contents slim but heavy with implication. It held a pattern: missing women, falsified arrests, surveillance footage that never made it to evidence rooms. Different cities, different victims, but a common thread ran through them all. Some officers weren't just turning a blind eye. They were holding the door open, and one name kept surfacing: Brent Kessler. He didn't know her then, not officially, but she had seen his type before. The spotless record, the polished boots, the look of authority that hardened when no one else was watching. His name appeared in more than one internal affairs report, most of them dismissed, sealed, or simply disappeared. Alyssa was sent to get closer, not to confront, but to confirm. Weeks passed. Surveillance. Notes. A digital trail of quiet meetings and unmarked vans that never stayed parked long. Alyssa had worked cases like this before, but something about this one felt different. Colder. And that night it shifted. She had followed a lead to a warehouse district just outside the city. Nothing unusual until Brent showed up. Not in response to a call. Not on assignment. He approached her car without protocol flashlight already raised. She kept her head low, tried to pass for someone unremarkable, but he wasn't interested in names or reasons. He told her to step out of the vehicle. No explanation, no warning. Alyssa played her part, calm and compliant, until his hand reached for the door handle. The look in his eyes changed, and not in a way that signaled confusion. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that didn't come from instinct, but from familiarity. He knew exactly who she wasn't supposed to be. She moved fast, controlled, efficient. A shoulder lock and a quick step backward was all it took to disable him just long enough to escape. She didn't leave a mark. But the bruised ego of a man like Brent didn't need bruises to retaliate. He filed a report that night, claimed she assaulted him without provocation, claimed she resisted arrest despite no record of a warrant, no report of a crime. By morning, Alyssa was at her handler's desk, waiting for protocol to override the chaos. She expected to be extracted. She expected to disappear like she had in missions past. But instead, the voice on the other end of the line stayed firm. "Stay quiet," it said. "We're not pulling you. We're pulling them." She was stunned. Her cover was blown. Her name was now public record. But the agency wasn't protecting her. Not yet. "Too much is in motion," the voice continued. "We're close. If this gets exposed now, the entire operation falls apart. We lose access, we lose intel, and people keep disappearing." So Alyssa did what she had been trained to do. She disappeared, but in plain sight. When the arrest came, she didn't resist. When the media framed her as violent, she said nothing. When her own name appeared on a docket beneath the words defendant, she folded her hands, lowered her gaze, and waited. Because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about the girls who never made it home. About the families who stopped getting answers. About a network that needed to believe no one was watching. And so she watched. From inside a courtroom that only saw a black woman in a jumpsuit. From behind eyes that refused to blink. From beneath a silence that everyone mistook for shame. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she had already made her choice. Not to fight back, not to defend herself, but to stay in the fire just long enough to trace where the smoke began. This wasn't surrender, this was strategy, and it was far from over. It wasn't just the handcuffs, or the ankle monitor, or even the orange jumpsuit Alyssa had been ordered to wear that morning, as if the state wanted to brand her before anyone had spoken a word. What struck most people watching that trial, whether they admitted it or not, was the unspoken script already in motion the moment she stepped into the courtroom. You could feel it. The weight of eyes that stayed too long on her skin. The way the bailiff lingered by her side just a little longer than necessary, like her stillness couldn't be trusted. The subtle shift in tone when her name was read aloud, Defendant Alyssa Grant, as if the word itself had already decided her place in the world. Across the aisle, Officer Brent Kessler sat in uniform, shoulders squared, chin lifted, posture built for a podium. He didn't just wear his badge, he performed it. The courtroom treated him not as a man accused of misconduct, but as a sentinel of truth. People nodded when he walked in. Jurors glanced at him with unspoken respect. And the judge never once asked him to keep his answers brief, never interrupted when his voice grew louder than the facts could carry. That same courtesy was not extended to Alyssa. When the defense attorney attempted to question the relevance of Kessler's past use of force reports, the judge waved it off as irrelevant to the current proceedings. When Alyssa looked up, maybe about to speak, maybe not, the judge raised his hand before she said a word. "You'll get your turn, Ms. Grant," he said, though his voice carried no intention of ever offering that turn freely. It was a room that had already made up its mind, and Alyssa knew it. The prosecutor took his time walking slowly as he addressed the jury, hands folded, voice measured but theatrical, just enough to keep the story alive. He didn't mention the lack of medical evidence. He didn't discuss why no body cam footage had been submitted. What he did do was paint Alyssa in broad, dangerous strokes. She was hostile. She resisted. She displayed an attitude of volatility not fit for civil society. And most importantly, she showed no remorse. He let that last word hang in the air. The jury, mostly white, shifted slightly in their chairs. Alyssa didn't flinch. The defense tried. They really did. They argued that there was no motive, that Alyssa had no history of violence, that there were gaps in Kessler's testimony. But without her speaking, they were arguing into a void. And the prosecutor used that silence like a weapon. She hasn't denied anything. She hasn't explained her actions. That's not strategy. That's guilt hiding in plain sight. But what they didn't understand, what no one in that courtroom even thought to consider, was that Alyssa's silence wasn't out of fear. It wasn't shame. It wasn't even resignation. It was duty. She could have spoken. She could have laid bare the truth, told them that Kessler had no probable cause, that the stop wasn't lawful, that he had tried to intimidate her and failed, that she had only defended herself long enough to escape, but doing so would have unraveled years of undercover work, put lives in jeopardy, and blown the lid off an operation that had barely begun to crack the surface. So she sat. But something began to shift, not in her words, but in her eyes. The longer the hearing went on, the more people began to notice that her gaze was steady. Too steady. Not the stare of someone afraid or cornered. It was the look of someone listening, someone measuring, someone who knew the exact moment things would change but hadn't yet decided if now was that moment. Even Kessler began to glance over at her more often, less confident than before. As if some part of him buried beneath his arrogance was beginning to question whether she was what he had convinced himself she was. And the judge, perhaps sensing something he couldn't quite place, grew more clipped with her attorney, more eager to push the trial forward. But Alyssa didn't move, didn't shift. She just let the room tilt more and more in his favor, like a scale she knew would eventually tip back if she waited long enough. What they all mistook for passivity was preparation. And though the courtroom hadn't seen it yet, something was coming. Something just beneath the surface, coiled and waiting. Because silence when chosen isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the beginning of power. The first time Alyssa truly understood what injustice felt like, she wasn't the one in handcuffs. She was 8. It was summer. Her father had taken her to a hardware store on the edge of town, a quick stop, nothing special. But by the time they left, he had bruises on his ribs and blood in his mouth, and she never saw that store the same way again. They said he fit the description. That was all. A man had stolen a lawnmower the week before, and someone thought he looked close enough. He never raised his voice, never resisted. But that didn't matter when 3 officers decided he didn't belong there. Alyssa remembered the sound of her own voice screaming as they threw him to the pavement right in front of her, hands behind his back, face to the gravel. Her father kept his eyes on her the entire time. He didn't cry out, not once. But his silence that day was not strength, it was shame. That memory lived in her. It changed her. Not overnight, not in one grand epiphany, but slowly. She started noticing who got followed in stores, who got asked for ID, who never made the evening news when they went missing. And by the time she was old enough to choose a path, she didn't hesitate. She didn't want a spotlight. She wanted access. She wanted reach. She wanted to fight back in a way they wouldn't see coming. Fight in the dark, she used to whisper to herself, so others don't have to. That became her code, her mission. Not just for her father, not just for what happened outside that store, but for the silence that swallowed so many people who looked like her who never got the chance to fight at all. She rose through training without ever once asking for attention. She didn't need to. Her precision spoke for her. Her patience became legendary. But that patience had come at a cost. She had watched 2 of her closest teammates disappear behind enemy lines when their cover slipped, because one of them trusted the wrong voice at the wrong time with the wrong truth. That moment had seared into her, branding her with a rule she never broke again. Never speak before the silence has served its purpose. Now sitting in that courtroom silence was once again her weapon. But it didn't mean she wasn't listening. Every word from the prosecution, every dismissive glance from the judge, every nod of sympathy toward Kessler. And then came the break. 15 minutes. Long enough for the room to breathe, but short enough to keep the tension tight. Alyssa stood beside her assigned guard, motionless. She didn't ask for water, didn't speak to her lawyer, just watched the corners of the room like she always did, measuring exits, studying movement. That's when he came, Kessler. Not loudly, not aggressively, just close, too close. He leaned in, pretending to adjust his tie, the posture of a concerned officer making a polite remark. But what he said dropped into the air like a lit match. "I know you're not who you say you are," he whispered, the edges of his smile sharpened by quiet threat. "You're not some nobody off the street. You walk like someone who's been trained to kill." Alyssa didn't blink. "I don't care what agency's protecting you. You're not walking out of this courtroom free. I'll make damn sure of it." It wasn't the words that landed hardest. It was the certainty behind them. The calm belief that the system was his to control, that the lies he'd spun were already concrete, that her silence had become a coffin. But what Kessler didn't understand, what he could never grasp, was that silence wasn't the end of her defense. It was the setup. When he stepped back, when he left her standing there under fluorescent lights and the weight of a broken system, the room didn't look different, but something had shifted. Like a wire pulled taut just 1 second from snapping, the jury returned. The judge re-entered. Everyone resumed their roles, unaware of what had just been said in the shadows. But Alyssa's stillness had changed. Slightly. Sharper now. Her eyes not just observant, but calculated. Not waiting any more timing, because now she wasn't just holding back for the mission. Now it was personal. There's a point when silence stops being strength and starts becoming a threat, not to the one holding it, but to those who can't control it. And that moment came fast, right after the recess ended. The courtroom had settled back into place, but the air had changed. It was tighter, the kind of atmosphere where something was bound to break. Alyssa could feel it before it even started, Brent's posture stiffening with the same arrogance he'd always carried, but now with an edge of frustration. He had been certain her silence would shrink her. Instead, it had unsettled him. He took the stand again, and this time he didn't stick to the script. The prosecutor prompted him gently, but Brent barely needed it. He stared across the room at Alyssa as he answered, almost like he was performing just for her. The jury noticed, of course, but the judge said nothing. Neither did the defense attorney, whose objections had already been overruled 3 too many times to bother anymore. Then came the question. "Officer Kessler, did the defendant ever speak to you during the incident?" Brent hesitated. Just a second, enough for his smile to slip out. "No, not a word. Not even when I asked what she was doing outside the restricted zone. She just stared, like she didn't think I had the authority to stop her." Then eyes locked on Alyssa, he added, "But she'll talk now, won't you?" Alyssa didn't move. The room went still. It wasn't part of the protocol, of course. The prosecutor hadn't told him to go off script like that. But no one stopped him either. "Go on," he said, voice louder now. "Tell them what you were doing out there. Tell them what kind of woman attacks a cop and then acts like she's above the law." Still, she said nothing, and that's when he stepped down. He wasn't supposed to. Witnesses don't leave the stand without instruction. But Brent didn't care. He walked across the room, slow and measured at first, pretending to adjust his belt like he had some place official to be. But then, he was at her side, standing too close, leaning in again. "You think you're untouchable," he muttered, low enough that only she could hear. You think hiding behind silence makes you powerful? Still, Alyssa didn't answer. And then he snapped. No warning, no hesitation. Just a sudden, violent swing of his arm that landed with a sickening thud against her shoulder close to her collarbone. The impact knocked her sideways in her seat, the gasp from the gallery like a single sharp breath sucked from 100 throats. Someone in the back fumbled with a phone, scrambling to open the camera. Another person shouted, "Hey!" but no one moved fast enough to stop it. A uniformed officer ran forward and grabbed Brent, pulling him back, but not with the urgency that the moment demanded. No cuffs, no Miranda warning, just a hand on his chest, telling him to step aside. The judge slammed his gavel once, twice. "Order in the court," he yelled, but the words fell like pebbles into a tidal wave. Brent stood there, chest heaving. Alyssa didn't cry out. She didn't look away. Instead, slowly, deliberately, she rose from her chair. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She wiped the blood at the corner of her lip with the back of her sleeve. The courtroom was dead silent now, every eye on her. She reached beneath her jumpsuit into the inner lining of her shirt and pulled out a thin metal badge. It glinted in the overhead lights as she held it high enough for everyone to see. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't need to be loud. "You just assaulted a federal asset," she said calmly, clearly currently engaged in an undercover assignment sanctioned by the Central Intelligence Agency. The room didn't move, not even a breath. Brent froze. The bailiff looked from her to the judge, and then back to her again, unsure whether to reach for his radio or fall to his knees. The prosecutor sat down so slowly it was as if his legs no longer trusted the ground. The silence this time wasn't Alyssa's. It belonged to everyone else now, because in that one sentence, she had flipped the entire weight of the courtroom. And for the first time in that trial, perhaps for the first time in his life, Brent Kessler understood what it felt like to be standing in the wrong place, facing the right kind of truth. For a long moment after Alyssa's voice cut through the courtroom, no one moved. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. People blinked, but didn't breathe. Somewhere behind the jury box, a woman covered her mouth with her hand, and the judge, who had spent the entire morning controlling the narrative, just stood there, eyes locked on the badge in Alyssa's hand, unable to form a single word. Brent, now backed against the witness stand by the same officer who had once treated him like a comrade, looked lost for the first time. His voice, when it came, was a stuttered mess. She's faking it. That's not real. She's impersonating. She's trying to manipulate this court." But his words, so loud and sharp before now, landed hollow, because something had changed. The badge wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a shift in power. A mirror turned back on the room, and in that reflection, people began to see things differently. The judge, still holding the gavel in midair, slowly lowered it to the bench without a word. His voice, so certain before, was suddenly cautious. "This proceeding," he began, then cleared his throat and tried again. "This proceeding is temporarily adjourned until proper verification can be obtained regarding the defendant's federal status." His eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, who looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under his podium. He didn't even try to object. Alyssa was escorted out of the room, not in cuffs this time, but between two officers who moved like they were no longer sure which side of the law they were standing on. She was taken not to holding, but to a secured interview room behind a locked hallway, away from cameras and away from noise. Meanwhile, Brent was quietly led through another door, the one typically reserved for witnesses. But he didn't walk with the swagger from earlier. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He just walked straight ahead, jaw tight, fingers clenched. Word spread fast. Within 15 minutes, the courthouse was buzzing. Phones out, voices hushed, but urgent. Reporters were outside already, though no one quite knew what they were reporting yet. Inside, whispers filled the hallways. That's when Warren Mace arrived. The sheriff walked in like he owned the building, which for years he almost had. Broad frame gray at the temples, reputation built on restoring law and order, he had backed Brent's promotion more than once. But today he didn't speak to Brent. He went straight to the judge's chamber door, shutting tight behind him. In the waiting area outside Alyssa's court-appointed lawyer, until this moment more like a bystander than an advocate, was still seated, papers in lap, head down. That's when she came. A woman in her late 50s, glasses low on her nose, court badge clipped to a plain navy blouse. One of the clerks' quiet, unnoticed someone people passed by every day. She stopped beside the lawyer and slipped him a folded envelope. No introduction, just a single sentence. You might want to look into the sealed internal affairs files. Start with April 2019. There were 3 complaints. Same officer, same pattern. Then she walked away, not waiting for acknowledgement. The lawyer opened the envelope. Inside was a single printed page. No cover sheet, no department letterhead, but enough to make him sit upright. 3 documented complaints, all by black civilians, all against Brent Kessler, all dismissed without hearing, each buried under vague, insufficient evidence rulings. One had included a hospital bill. Another had a witness. None made it past the first stage. The lawyer looked up at the closed courtroom door, then at the security camera above him. Suddenly the case wasn't just about one punch. It was about everyone that had come before it. And Alyssa, who had walked in that morning as a defendant, chained and silent, was no longer the one under the spotlight, because the system had just blinked. And when a system blinks, the truth starts crawling out of the shadows. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom was no longer where the story lived. It had moved, leapt from marble floors and echoed hallways to glowing phone screens and millions of watchful eyes. All it took was a single punch captured on a shaky cell phone video and the silence that followed it. Then came the hashtag, CIA in chains. The video spread fast, first through private messages, then into public feeds. It showed everything: the restraint on Alyssa's face, the aggression in Brent's, the sound of flesh hitting bone, and finally, most damning of all, the quiet unveiling of the CIA badge. In a matter of hours, the footage was on national broadcasts. Prime-time anchors used the word alarming. Civil rights leaders called it a federal disgrace. Outside the courthouse, people began to gather. Not with rage or chants, but with a kind of focused silence, holding signs, live streaming, watching. Their presence said what the courtroom hadn't. We're paying attention now. And that pressure reached places most people never see. Inside a sealed chamber, a representative from the CIA presented documentation directly to the presiding judge. It was simple and official. Alyssa Grant was an active federal operative working under classified directive. Her silence had been ordered, her actions justified, and her detainment a serious breach. The courtroom's power balance shifted instantly. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't even just a citizen. She was, in the eyes of the federal government, an asset who had been assaulted in open court while carrying out a lawful mission. No apology was given. No press conference held. But the judge signed a release order without hesitation. Alyssa walked out not as a defendant but as a woman reclaimed. The cuffs were gone. The guards walked behind her, not in front. And the cameras now everywhere caught the change in posture. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't celebrate. She simply walked like someone who had nothing left to prove. When asked by her lawyer if she intended to sue, she didn't hesitate. "No, I don't want compensation, I want exposure." The lawyer blinked. Exposure of what? She met his eyes, calm as ever. Of how this system let a man like Brent walk unchecked for years. How the silence around him wasn't ignorance, it was protection. Those words found their way into every journalist's notebook. And just like that, the story stopped being about one courtroom or one cop or even one agency. It became about the pattern. That night, CNN picked up the story. MSNBC followed. By morning, the Secretary of Justice had been briefed. A full internal review of Officer Brent Kessler's conduct was announced, beginning with 6 years' worth of cases involving excessive force or racial bias. The State Ethics Committee launched a parallel investigation into the DA's office. Every prosecutor who had worked with Brent was flagged for review. And then came the order that changed everything: a subpoena. Brent Kessler was summoned to a closed-door disciplinary hearing, not as a witness, not as a victim, but as the subject of formal inquiry. He no longer wore this badge with pride. Now it weighed like a question. And Alyssa, whose silence once looked like submission, had shattered the foundation of a courtroom with 5 calm words and a flash of metal. What began as a false accusation became a reckoning. Because when a single blow goes viral, when the truth slips past the script, and when the right person refuses to play the role assigned to them, systems don't just crack. They collapse piece by piece under their own weight. The hearing room wasn't as grand as a courtroom, but somehow it felt heavier. There were no sweeping benches, no wood-paneled walls, Just a long table, tired chairs, and the scent of consequence hanging in the air. The public was allowed in. Not everyone came to gloat. Some were just there to witness what accountability looked like if it would actually show up this time. Brent sat stiff in a gray suit that didn't quite fit right, the fabric bunching at the shoulders like it was trying to escape him. He wasn't in uniform anymore. That privilege had been revoked the moment his suspension took effect. Now, he was just a man, no badge, no authority, surrounded by people who weren't afraid to see him. The panel opened with testimony from the courtroom clerk, a woman in her 50s who had never spoken above a whisper during a proceeding in all her years. But today she raised her voice. She recalled Brent's tone, his posture, the way he leaned in when he didn't need to, the way Alyssa had sat still like stone. Then came Officer James, one of the younger patrolmen assigned to courtroom security that day. His voice cracked once, but he didn't stop. He said it plainly. I froze. I should have intervened sooner. That punch wasn't just sudden, it was personal. He wanted to hurt her. The final exhibit was the video played again, this time on a wide monitor frame by frame. The panel watched in silence. The room did too. And for the first time since the story broke, Brent didn't interrupt. His face twitched, but he said nothing. Not yet. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't go quietly. He insisted the video was misleading, that he'd felt threatened, that Alyssa had a look in her eyes like she was trained to kill. He even accused the clerk of exaggeration and questioned Officer James's loyalty. The more he spoke, the smaller the room seemed to grow around him. What began as defense turned into unraveling. His voice grew louder, more defensive. He blamed policies, blamed the press, blamed this whole woke paranoia. At one point, a panelist asked him directly, "Officer Kessler, are you aware you're under oath?" He paused, then muttered, "Yeah. I know exactly where I am." And still he said nothing about the punch, not an apology, not a trace of regret. Then Alyssa was called to the stand. For the first time, without restriction, without chains, without fear of compromising anything, she spoke, and she didn't raise her voice either. She didn't need to. She talked about restraint, about what it costs to be silent in a system that doesn't deserve your silence. She explained the mission as much as she was allowed to. How she'd been assigned to monitor internal corruption linked to a trafficking network. How Brent had disrupted the operation, then lied about what happened. But what she emphasized most wasn't the operation, it was the moment in court. That man hit me in front of everyone. And no one stopped him, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think I was worth protecting. I didn't stay quiet because I was scared. I stayed quiet because I believed somehow that if I honored the system, maybe it would honor me back. I was wrong. There was a long pause when she finished. The kind of silence that doesn't need words to be loud. The panel took only minutes to deliberate. The outcome wasn't a surprise. Brent Kessler was permanently terminated from law enforcement. His license revoked. He was referred for federal prosecution on charges of assaulting a federal employee, perjury, and obstruction. He didn't yell as the decision was read. He didn't walk out with a final glare. He sat there blinking as if trying to remember how it all came apart. When Alyssa rose to leave, she didn't look back. But something remarkable happened. The room stood, no fanfare, no cheering, just people rising to their feet. Quiet. Still. A collective act of recognition, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the sheer dignity it took to walk through fire and not burn with it. Outside the hearing room, the sun was already setting. Reporters leaned in with microphones ready to grab her words. But Alyssa said only one thing. "Tell them I showed up, even when the system didn't." Then she walked into the orange light taller than any verdict. The storm had passed, at least on the surface. The headlines began to fade, moving down the screen as newer crises claimed the spotlight. But for those who had watched closely, something lingered. Something that couldn't be shaken by a news cycle. Alyssa didn't grant interviews. She didn't go on talk shows or post on social media. When her name was mentioned in the press, it was always with a kind of reverent distance, as if even journalists sensed she wasn't someone to be packaged or simplified. She never raised her voice. But the one line she did share, tucked quietly in a classified internal bulletin to fellow CIA operatives, spread farther than any televised soundbite. Justice requires timing, not volume. No one could trace how it got leaked. But once it did, it took on a life of its own. It appeared in think pieces on protest signs, even quoted in a college commencement speech. It wasn't just a statement, it was a philosophy. And it belonged to someone who had lived it under chains. 1 month later, a well-known civil rights group reached out asking Alyssa to speak at a summit on policing reform. The invitation was genuine. They offered support, a platform, even a chance to lead a national campaign on justice accountability. She declined, politely, firmly. "I work in the places people don't look," she said, almost like a whisper. "And I belong where silence still has a purpose." Some didn't understand. Others respected it even more. And then came the last image of Brent Kessler anyone would ever see. It wasn't a press release or court transcript. It was a blurry photo snapped through the back window of a transport van. He was seated, cuffed, head low, jaw clenched. The man who once strutted through a courtroom now disappeared into a system he used to control. There was no uniform, no badge, only the look of someone whose fall had come too late to change him. Alyssa saw the photo. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak his name again, not even once. That same evening, she stepped outside a safe house far outside the city and dialed a number that hadn't changed in 20 years. Her mother answered on the third ring. That familiar warmth, unshaken by the years, poured through the line. "Hi, Mama," she said, her voice low. There was a pause. "Baby, are you okay?" Alyssa looked out toward the tree line, the wind moving gently through the pines. "Everything's fine now," she said, and meant it. "And I've never once regretted who I became." They didn't say much more. They didn't have to. Because sometimes the loudest part of a story is how it ends quiet, clean, and without apology. The room was still. Late morning light spilled gently through half-drawn curtains, tracing soft shadows across the polished wood of the kitchen table. Alyssa sat alone, hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. She didn't speak, and yet somehow the space around her felt full of memory, of clarity, of something finally settled. On the table sat 2 objects. One, a silver badge, its edges worn by years of quiet work. The other, a small black USB drive, sealed and coded and marked only with a date. She'd sent her final message to Langley earlier that morning. No fanfare. Just 3 lines typed with the precision of someone who knew every word mattered more than a name. Operation concluded. Subject exposed. Structure cracked. That was all. There would be others who picked up the pieces, analysts, agents, congressional aides hungry for oversight. But Alyssa's part in it was finished. And it ended not with applause, not with headlines, not with her name etched into some heroic summary. It ended with peace. With the kind of stillness that doesn't follow surrender, but completion. In the background, the television played at low volume. A news anchor shifted between stories, his voice smooth and practiced. A brief mention passed about renewed investigations into law enforcement misconduct accompanied by stock footage of courtrooms and police stations. No images of her, no mention of her name. That, too, was part of the deal. Her truth had never needed a spotlight-only room to land. She took another sip of coffee, not rushed, not burdened, just present. The room smelled faintly of cedar and warmth. From the open window came the distant hum of a city starting its day, people rushing horns, sounding life, insisting on itself. But here in this little pocket of time, Alyssa breathed without armor. She thought briefly of the courtroom again. The moment Brent's fist flew. The split second when her silence ended not in rage, but in purpose. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought back with fists or fury. She'd simply stood badge in hand and reminded the room what they were looking at. It wasn't just a woman in chains. It was the cost of assuming silence meant surrender. She looked down at this badge again. It would be returned soon, locked back in a secure vault where no one would touch it for a while. The USB, too, would be extracted, copied, then wiped. The world would move on as it always did. But somewhere in the marrow of the system, something had shifted. Just slightly. Enough to let light in. Alyssa stood slowly, her movements unhurried. She wasn't going anywhere. Not today. She had no debrief, no transport, no next assignment waiting in the wings. She simply stood because the coffee was finished and the day was hers again. At the window, she paused, resting a hand lightly on the sill. The street below buzzed with life she didn't need to control or analyze. She smiled, small, almost invisible, but real. And then, without turning away, the thought came. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just quiet and inevitable. She let the silence settle around it, not breaking the moment. Because some stories don't end with victory. They end with understanding. And that more than anything is what she had earned. And that's where her story ends, not with noise, but with clarity. Alyssa reminded us that sometimes strength means staying silent until the right moment. That real power doesn't always come from shouting louder. It comes from standing firm when the world expects you to break. Through her quiet resistance and unshakable purpose, she exposed not just a man, but a system built on injustice. If this story moved, you take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful narratives that honor truth, courage, and unseen strength. Your support means the world to us. It helps our creative team keep bringing these stories to life, one voice at a time. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them.